All right, it looks like we're now live for the birthday bash, and I'm happy to see people here already. Dominic says, I wish you a happy birthday. Hope you're doing well. Funny thing, it's my birthday too, so happy birthday to you, Dominic. I'm now in my second week of reading Being in Time. It's difficult, but I like the challenge, so that's awesome. Yeah, Being in Time is gonna take you a while, and it's something that you're gonna have to read and reread, like most philosophical classics. Harald Kavli, a good friend of mine over in Norway, has donated to Urban Cat Coalition, which is a local organization here that does a lot of great work homing feral and abandoned and sheltered cats in different places, arranging adoptions, fostering, stuff like that, getting them off the streets, so to speak. So I don't really have a huge plan for this session other than to say, maybe I'll talk a little bit about aging and, a few things I've learned along the way and birthdays and stuff like that. I have a cousin actually whose birthday it is as well. Julia, who's a good bit younger than me, she's got the same birthday. And we were looking up famous birthdays. And of course, there's like tons and tons of people who have any day you pick are going to have your birthday. But a year older than me is Christian Slater and Edward Norton. And so my wife was remarking at breakfast that it's a bad boys birthday club of sorts. So all right, so people are wishing happy birthdays, Bruce, Nishant, and Alex. Thanks very much for that. And I'll talk a little bit about what's going on the rest of the day, because some of you may find that interesting. So, dinner tonight is at the Calderone Club, an Italian place where we went last year, just down the block from us here in Milwaukee. And I had spaghetti and meatballs, which was, my favorite dish as a child, and I still like quite a bit today. Last time, but I might have something different this time around. And before that, we are going to the Sip and Purr Cat Cafe. Some of you may remember from social media that when we were in Green Bay, ironically, not for a football game, but a soccer game earlier this summer, my wife Andy and I stopped in at this, I forget exactly what the name was, but it was a cat shelter. And you could go in and hang out. And they had all these, cats who, most of whom were special needs, like, who had been like hit by cars or birth defects or things like that, or who were, it was sort of a cat hospice as well. I actually spent about an hour with an older cat who was dying of cancer and just sat with her in my lap. Her name was Agnes. And so we're going to this cat cafe, and it's not quite so hospice oriented. They have kittens and they have other cats up for adoption, and you have to reserve a time and go in for about an hour, and you get to hang out with the cats, which is kind of nice for me, particularly since we lost Sassy earlier this year. I do love cats and dogs and other animals, and so getting to spend some time with them and you know make a little donation is a nice thing. All right, so let's see. I'm also going to be doing some work on my Marquette classes, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Let me look at the comments again. So Drewer says, speaking of recurring dates and time circles, you should look into astrology. Yeah, I'm not into astrology. Had plenty of time in my life to look into that, and I it goes back to ancient times, and ancient philosophers talk about why it's actually wrong themselves, including everyone from Aristotle to Augustine. Um, Bruno says, I always think Italian is great. Yeah, it depends on the place, right? Massacre says, happy birthday. I appreciate you because you taught me to be more critical, less committed to any philosophy, and have a less reductive worldview. Happy birthday. Thanks. Yeah, actually, I was talking with a friend and client earlier today, a guy who's about my age in London who had a very different, life and has gotten into philosophy. And he was asking me, so you're you're not committed to any one particular philosopher. How do you handle having these like competing voices in your head? And I said, well, most of the time they're pretty quiet. It's sort of like having a hallway that you're living in a common house, and each person's got their own room. If you go knock on their door, maybe they'll come out. Sometimes they're wandering the halls and, jabbering about this or that, but most of the time you can kind of pick and choose which one you want. Good. Mark Smith's here. A good friend of mine says, hope you've had a great birthday. Want to donate, but seems it's not set up for here. Thanks for doing the fundraiser. Have a beer for me later. Yeah, I suppose I probably didn't set up things properly in terms of monetization or something. Drewer says cat equals euphemism. No, cats are just cats, just like, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, as Freud observed, right? Only in Space says happy birthday to our stoic YouTube dad. Well, I'm not really a stoic, stoicism is just one of the philosophies that I draw on rather eclectically. Patricia says, hope you've had a great birthday. Thanks for everything you do. Cannot thank you enough for getting me started on Plato, Hegel, and Stoicism. That's awesome. Yeah. There's so many great things in philosophy out there. And since we have a little pause in the comments, I'll say another thing. By the way, again, I don't have any structure for this. It's going to be just kind of rambling and uh, picking up whatever people want to put down and going with it. But thinking to like, who should we cover in philosophy, right? This is a perennial issue, especially for like introductory classes. So I'm teaching effectively an intro class. It's called Foundations of Philosophy, but it's really an intro class. I'm teaching that this semester at Marquette University, and you always have to like figure out, okay, who are we actually going to cover? And there's so many interesting thinkers and texts and topics that you can only do like a little tiny bit. And you can try to do it by being very representative, but that never really works. Or you can pick a particular emphasis for that class. I usually choose three main themes that I orient everything around. One is human nature. Another is the virtues and the vices, and you could call it human anthropology, parts of the soul. And then the third thing is usually like free will and determinism and choice and where that fits into that. And so we look at some Plato, some Aristotle, some Cicero. There's a little bit of Lucretius in there, some Anselm, some Augustine, some Aquinas, some Descartes, some Hobbes, some Hume, some Mary Wollstonecraft. We finish up with Sartre and de Beauvoir. And you think about that, it sounds like a pretty good class, but it's like looking at a spectrum of light and only getting a little bit of this and this and this and this, which is it's always kind of a downer. And I can say the same thing about my video production, right? People are like, oh wow, you got so many videos covering like everybody. And my response is usually, it's not covering everybody by any means. And there's so many huge gaps that I would like to fill in. And maybe I will over the next 10 years. But even with that, there's still going to be massive gaps. So, all right, Harold says, happy birthday. This is also the birthday of Antonio Salieri and the death day of Genghis Khan. Well, that's quite something, Alex says, Putnam. I'm not sure what that means. Casual philosophy. What do you think is philosophically interesting about metal as a musical genre? Oh, all sorts of things. I mean, that's why Scott Terulli and I have been doing that classic metal class where we bring in all sorts of philosophy related things. We've been doing that now for I think close to 2 years, and maybe even a little bit longer. Not quite sure. I'd have to look in the videos when we actually started it, and yeah, there's all sorts of things where you can say there's like applications of philosophical issues to the world of heavy metal, and they would apply also to other genres as well. Like for instance, when does a band cease being the same band? If it has only one original member in it and that one original member is kind of a marginal person, can it call itself the same band or not? Well, that's a metaphysical question, right? Or we another one that we picked was what makes best albums the best, and so that's a question of value, right? Which is also quite interesting as well. And then you can ask about like, are genres real? Do they designate something that is a hard distinction or not? And there's interesting things about you look at like the background of some of these great metal artists where there's a lot of reflection on what's going on, like Ronnie James Dio. I think all of you know I'm a huge fan of Ronnie James Dio, and I consider him to be probably the smartest person ever in the field of heavy metal. And that's saying a lot because there's some pretty brilliant thinkers in there, very reflective people. So, I mean, those are some connections, I would say. Um, Mark has a question for me. Since you call yourself a Ciceronian eclectic, I'm wondering what you would think of somebody calling themselves a Sadlerian eclectic. What would that mean to you? I mean, I think that it's one of those things where Cicero is pretty famous, and if you say to somebody, "I'm a Ciceronian eclectic," they might not know what that means, but at least they'll have somebody to associate that with. If you call yourself a Sadlerian eclectic, I think nobody's going to know what you're talking about. Right? And since I am a Ciceronian style eclectic, it would be kind of redundant to have an extra term in there, I think, right? Um, so a lot of people saying happy birthday. Thanks for that. And Michael Gonzalez says my birthday is tomorrow, so happy birthday in advance to you. Um, Even says, glad for all your videos, happy to help contribute to a good cause. The Urban Cat Coalition, as I was mentioning at the top of the hour, they do a lot of great work. They are they don't have an actual physical location. They coordinate cats who have been, feral or abandoned or are in tough circumstances. They coordinate fostering and adoption efforts, and also, send litter and food and toys and all these sorts of things to the places they need to go. So it's a great organization here in the Milwaukee area. Um, Albert says, live long and prosper. Let me see if I can do there we go. Yes, live long and prosper. Got the Vulcan salute. Mark says, I like the discussion on rebellion as a theme. This is referencing the classic metal class. Had some nostalgic value. Also made me appreciate how much has remained constant in my character over the years. Powell says, certainly good metal bands touch on existential philosophy at the Gates' recent albums. Yeah, and I should mention too, when it comes to metal, I'm not listening to all that much recent or contemporary stuff, and I don't do much in the genres that have really taken a lot, like death and black metal, or these very niche things where it's like Scandinavian black pirate metal or things like that. I do like power metal and doom metal, but I don't like seek out new bands all that much. It's enough just to like go back into the 70s and 80s for me and find a lot of the bands and things, the albums that I missed in that time, because we live in this incredible era of the internet where, growing up here in Wisconsin, you wouldn't hear about a lot of the bands that were around until they made it big, and then they were in the record stores or they're being played on the radio, or you'd read about them in Circus Magazine, right? And so quite a few of these, I'm discovering from like 2010 onward, and so that's kind of cool. All right, a lot of questions people are bringing up. Dominic, any thoughts on anarchism, Bakunin or Kropotkin? Not really. It's been a long time since I've read any of that literature, and it's not really something that I work in. World to Win just popped by to say hello, voice my appreciation for the philosophy education you put out into the world. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I like. I mean, I like what I do. That was one of the things I was going to do is reflect a little bit on my life so far. I've been pretty fortunate. Um, some of you may have seen, recently I put out another Twitter video where we're looking at the role that luck in many different levels plays in academic hiring and jobs. And man, does it play a huge role. And I've been pretty fortunate. I haven't been fortunate in the sense of like, getting the plum job. I mean, the only time I was on the tenure track was for 3 years at Fayetteville State University. But I've been pretty lucky in my career overall that I was started producing videos when YouTube was taking off, and I reached a sizable audience that I'm still reaching today, because there's this hunger out there for substantive engagement with philosophical ideas that just isn't being met by the um, the culture and by academic institutions. And I've been lucky that I've been able to teach in academic institutions now for 22, 23 years. I get sometimes more class requests than I can actually fill. And, I mean, look at what's behind me, all these great books. This is my wealth, right? This is where a lot of our money is tied up in, those in the bookshelves. And I'm happy with that. I could spend the rest of my life working on this stuff and probably never have to retire. So yeah. Um, Batu, what's your take on moral realism versus anti-realism? I'm not really an ism person, so I don't really worry too much about those kinds of debates and disputes. Albert, have you ever thought about dressing like Greeks did in ancient times? I mean, not as like something I would do day to day, or really even for special occasions, but I did think about doing some stuff very early on with YouTube that would be like Socratic dialogues. And this is back when I was at Fayetteville State University, and I had a colleague, Richard Hall, who was an older guy, British, had done some acting, so a lot of stage presence, and I thought he could be Socrates, and I could be like Meno or Ion, or some other guy, and I'd let my hair down, and we'd wear togas and sit around and film it. Actually, my colleague Michelle Carpenter was saying she might be willing to get in on it, and then I left. So that never came to fruition. But I thought that would be kind of a cool thing. All right, World to Win, Periphery has some really intense poetic and philosophical lyrics on top of incredible musicianship. Not sure if they'd be my taste, but give them a try. Yeah, maybe I will. I got so many other bands to listen to already. It's hard to stay on top of things, right? And even the classic bands are like putting out new albums. Once Scott and I resume classic metal class, we're going to do another review session where we're just going to be looking at new wave of British heavy metal bands that have put out new albums within the last couple of years, like Rock Goddess and Raven, and Tigers of Pain Tang has a great new album. So it's hard to stay on top of all of this stuff. um Malcolm has a good question here. Best birthday memory. So I would say one of the ones that really sticks with me, I was 6 years old, and we'd moved into this house out in the countryside, in a subdivision, which took a while to actually develop. And I want to say the house was built like in 74, and maybe we moved in 74 or early 75. And so for my sixth birthday in 1976, which was like a big year. That was the year of the bicentennial. So around 4th of July. I remember like riding my big wheel in a parade in the town of Delafield, or maybe it was the village of Wales that we lived close by to. In any case, a couple things happened on my birthday that year. The first thing was that a stray cat that my grandfather had brought from Chicago and let loose in our yard, and then she went into the woods behind our place. She came into the garage and had kittens in the morning. And we went out there and we hear all this like, mewing sounds. And sure enough, she's there with like five kittens in a kiddie pool, where she'd chosen to go. And my mom was like, don't touch them. They're blind. They can't do anything. But of course, it didn't take long before we're picking them up and holding them and looking at them and all that. They all went out to northwestern Indiana, to my grandfather and grandmother's place, and lived for a while out there. And they didn't last, super super long because they were all outside cats. So that was one thing. And then my mom had put together a birthday party, and it was like all the neighborhood kids. And one of the neighborhood kids, who was considerably older, he was in high school, one of the Schmidt boys, and I don't remember the name of him. I hung out with Steve Schmidt some of the time, and the sister would sometimes babysit us, but this was like the older one, so he was probably like a senior in high school. He did magic, like he did magic shows and stuff like that, and so he put on a magic show. And the thing that I remember is he did a trick with a cake, right? Where you like crack the eggs into your hat and all this kind of stuff. And then boom, here's the cake. And the cake wasn't particularly good. And my mom was like, well, that's because he left the eggshells in there. So those are some interesting birthday memories. I mean, I've had so many, I suppose, right? All right. Travis Burke, thoughts on Erigena? Interesting guy, important in the history of medieval philosophy and Neoplatonism. That's about it. Drewer ever dug into this Nick Land and CCRU hyperstition stuff? Yeah, I've actually got Land's Fang Numina. I was on a podcast about that about a year ago or so. My take is that Nick Land is very overrated and is basically just doing the kind of stuff that we did in continental philosophy in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And, there's nothing particularly remarkable about it. He's not terrible. He's not, great. And then he went off the deep end. I guess he fancied himself a real auteur, and got into the dark enlightenment stuff. And the dark enlightenment stuff, I mean, I started reading that stuff back in the early 2000s when mensis moldbug was kind of becoming a big thing. And you could see even then that it wasn't like something radically new. It was a regurgitation of Charles Marat, traditionalism in other respects, just updated for the internet age. And so Land is okay. He's not terrible. He's not great. That's what I would say. Um, all right. Let's see. What do we got here? Just skipped a little bit. Mark says, a cheesy question, but worthwhile. What would you say if you go back to your 20-year-old self? Speculate about what your 70-year-old self would have to say about you now. I mean, I don't know what the 70-year-old self would have to say. I imagine he'll be in a similar trajectory to what I'm doing today, maybe still producing videos. I mean, who knows what YouTube is going to look like 20 years from now, though, right? But 20-year-old self, I mean, I was entering college, having been in the army, having worked in restaurants. I would say, there's a lot of things that I thought were like really important back then that I was mixed up about, and I was pretty rigid in a lot of ways that I'm not so much today. So maybe I would say, I don't know, from the vantage point of the future, a lot of the things that you consider to be absolutely important probably are less important than you think so, and you shouldn't get too worked up about them, you know. Um, Nishant says, apart from philosophy, what have been your view on poetry as an alternative way to look at life? Wordsworth fan here. I don't actually get that much out of poetry. I have to admit, you know, when I'm reading it, there's only certain authors that I kind of connect with, like Rainer Maria Rilke, and I probably get more out of Rilke's letters than I do out of some of his poetry. Although his stuff is pretty great. I tend to like the ones where there is some meat to it, right? So Wordsworth is a good example of that. I mean, Shakespeare's sonnets are another good example. John Donne, you know. Um, I'll actually tell you an interesting story with respect to poetry. So I used to sit in on when I was an undergraduate in college on these poetry classes, in part because some of my friends were going to them, and in part because this woman that I was dating was also a writing major at the time. And Carl Elder was he was a cool guy, and he was also quite critical. Like people would try stuff in the poetry class and be like, "That's too didactic. You know, what are you trying to prove to people?" You know, and so he was kind of a harsh critic, and he liked the stuff that I was bringing to class. I would write sonnets and things like that. And I went into his office one time and I said, you know, I'm thinking about dropping the philosophy major and changing to writing. And he said, oh, that's a terrible idea. And I said, well, why? Because, you know, he's like denigrating his own craft. And he said, well, you know, all these kids come in here and they just want to write about things. And a lot of their writing is kind of meta. It's writing about how hard it is to write and stuff like that. Stick with a field where you're actually like studying something, because then you'll have something to write about and it won't be all this boring crap that they're writing, you know. I was like, well, okay, I guess that makes sense. You know, so you can always be a writer, you know, but don't study writing, you know. And I thought, oh, that's kind of a cool idea. So that's what I ended up doing. Andy, good to see you. Happy birthday, Greg. We need to chat soon. Andy, by the way, is working on his master's, which is great to see. Um, he and I have corresponded a couple times, well, actually a number of times about different philosophers. And I was talking with somebody earlier today about this. I think a lot of people wind up coming to me in part because in academic philosophy, so many professors and programs give the students so little helpful guidance, you know, about like, well, how should you work on this, or what should you study, or things like that. So all right. Harold says, what do you think about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that our perception of the world is affected by the language that we speak? If you've got the weak version of it framed like that, then I think yes. When it's extended into the strong version, which says that we're basically like isolated in our own little linguistic worlds, I don't really buy that, because you know, it's not as if every language is its own sphere of incommensurability with other languages. The fact that we can translate between them, you know, certainly uh, means something. So, Casual Philosophy, Sadler React series incoming. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that. Reacts to what? Like, you mean like reaction videos where I'm listening to somebody playing something and then I like ham it up for the camera. I'm like, ooh, wow, this is such amazing music. Holy crap. You know, I don't think I'll ever do things like that, because those strike me as a lot of them are kind of ungenuine, you know. Or, you know, watching something gross or watching something, yeah, I don't know that I'll do those. I mean, I got so much other stuff to do, right? Albert says, thanks for reading my rants. Although all countries have philosophy in their culture, I always default to ancient Greece. Yeah, I mean, there's philosophy going on in all sorts of places. So only in space, best birthday gift too. Well, that's nice too. Bruno, have you ever imagined Plato's Republic transformed into a play? Okay, so going back to the dialogues thing, the challenge with these sorts of things is that there's very little action taking place, right? And so to turn Platonic dialogues into plays, especially longer Platonic dialogues, where there's not an awful lot of action happening, I think is kind of tough because you need to be able to hold your audience's attention, right? So, I mean, even like Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion would suffer from a similar problem. You'd need to like jazz it up somehow, you know. Now with the Republic, you do have you do have the opportunity to like as Socrates is talking about the city, you know, this imaginary city, you could like have scenes like where he's talking about the education, right? You have like a little scene, or the allegory of the cave, of course. There's dramatizations of that as well, or the you know the myth of the afterlife towards the end. Um, but that would be tough to pull off. Actually, that would be kind of a cool thing to attempt. But I don't know who would actually take it on. I would hope that they would stick close to the text and you know have consultant who's a philosopher on it. That would be kind of good. But yeah, that'd be kind of neat to see. I think. Um, Got a lot of messages here. So, Absalom, how important is philosophy as a tool for improving mental health? Is it a useful aid for an overall population or just on an individual basis? I would say, both and everything in between, but it depends on what kind of philosophy you're talking about. Are we talking about having people read contemporary pieces in analytic philosophy, very narrowly focused? That's probably not going to do an awful lot of good other than fostering the capacity to like make distinctions and break down arguments. If we're talking about studying Stoicism or Aristotelian ethics, okay, maybe that might have some more direct application to a person's life, or to a population, right? Muhammad says, "Happy birthday, Professor. Hope you have a wonderful day. I'm sure you know birthdays weren't as well recorded in history than dates of death. How have you approached ideas and even your own death?" I mean, I don't really think about my own death that much. I really need to start getting my butt in gear, and like get a will, and that will has to include um, my digital presence as well. I probably need something like a literary executor, except for all these videos and podcasts and stuff like that. Um, I mean, I've grown up with death. Um, like a good friend of mine who I think is here, Bruce, that Heideggerian being towards death, I've always had that. I've always known that people can die, including myself, and that existence is precarious since I was a kid. Um, and I've had a lot of people in my life pass away, so I'm kind of prepared for it. I mean, I'd like to live as long as I can because I want to be with the people I love and accomplish things that I think are worth doing. But if I had to die tomorrow, I wouldn't say that I've missed out on too much in life. And, I'd want to provide for the people that are important for me, my wife, my kids. Um, some of my friends perhaps could get some of these books, although coordinating that would be kind of difficult. Max says hi from Ukraine. Happy birthday. Love your content. Thanks. Um, and we got some more birthday wishes from Drewer, Robert. Albert says, thanks for reading. Oh, I already looked at that one. It looks like maybe that's a repeat. DC Trevitt, have you any experience with pataphysics? Nope, I don't have any experience with that. Ben Duvall, what are your thoughts on the Great Reset plan of the WEF Frankfurt School neo-Marxist influences on Western culture? I think that's silliness. There isn't a Frankfurt neo-Marxist influence on Western culture. when you actually start looking into things and you get away from like silly right wing blogs and books and videos. Um, I mean, it'd be a better thing if there was actually some real influence of that. Casual philosophy, when you see a band and a significant number of them are music grads, you know it'll be technically good but boring. I wouldn't say that at all. I mean, a good person to kick that over to would be Scott Cerulli, who teaches at the Berkeley School of Music and has a number of former students in metal bands out there, and they're quite good. Andromeda, thoughts on David Foster Wallace. I've only read a little bit of his stuff. Didn't find it very interesting. I think he's kind of overrated and just not interested in him. Um, oh, this is interesting. Rhino Horn. It was pretty awesome when you showed up for University of Wisconsin Eau Claire. So that was years ago when I first got here to Wisconsin. That would have been for the Wisconsin Philosophy Society when University of Eau Claire was hosting it. So we must have met then. So that's kind of cool. Powell agreed on Sapir-Whorf. What if a person grew up speaking 5 languages? It does affect some aspects of life, but not the entire perception. Yeah, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, like conjectures, don't take into account multilingualism. Which can be like you grew up speaking them. It could be you studied them. There's all different ways of knowing a language and using a language. So I think sometimes we got to get into the distinctions to talk about that. Ken Blackwell, somebody who comes and contributes quite a bit to the heavy metal classes, says, "Happy birthday to you." Thanks, Ken. Always good to see you. Um, KSBF in Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche said at 31 is but a child. You're a strapping man now. Happy birthday. Thank you for your output. Yeah, I mean, Nietzsche, he says a lot of things, doesn't he? I wouldn't necessarily take them all I wouldn't believe all the things that he says necessarily, but as Aristotle remarks, some people are immature in their years and other people are immature in their minds. So you could be 52 and still be pretty childish in many respects. Keaton, happy birthday. Thanks for helping me understand philosophy. I'm reading St. John of the Cross's poetry now. Any thoughts or tips? I've never read his poetry. The only thing that I've read by him is the stuff that pertains to the 7 deadly sins. I'm not a big fan of mystics in general, and so he's not somebody I've actually spent enough time on to say much about. Anti-Gaia, are you at all interested in the George R. R. Martin Targaryen prequel series coming to TV soon? Interestingly enough, my wife and I were just discussing that last night. Um, I'm not interested in it at all. And we watched the preview for it, and I was like, "Oh, great! More attractive people put into, stunning backdrops, saying dramatic things. It's not something that I want to see put on TV for me. I mean, what I would love to see is George R. R. Martin finish the last 2 books, and who knows if that's going to happen or not. But um, I don't have high hopes for adaptations of fantasy stuff by these streaming services. I'm not interested in watching the Tolkien prequels either about the Second Age. None of this stuff really looks that well set in the narrative universes to me. I mean, Martin created in the books a really interesting narrative universe. I think Game of Thrones kind of, so to speak, screwed the pooch when it comes to seasons, from 6 onward. It was just not very good. So, all right. Nishant says the only thing that affects my thinking is worrying how to translate into other languages. Never noticed any significant thing. Yeah. Powell points out Stoicism influenced at least 2 therapy approaches. Donald Robertson has actually pointed out that it had an influence on early 19th century French psychotherapy as well that got kind of lost and submerged. Yeah. Keaton says, on the subject of music, do you have a favorite band? Mine is Animal Collective. Are you familiar? I don't know Animal Collective. Do I have a favorite band? If you'd asked me like 30 years ago, I would have said Iron Maiden. I don't really have a favorite band now. If I had to pick like among metal bands, my top ones, not surprising. Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Motorhead, Dio, Rat, Tank, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple. You know, those are Rainbow in the Dio era, Metallica in the Cliff Burton era, including, willing to include Injustice for All, but forget all the other stuff after that. You know, those are among my favorites. Well, the Scorpions too, I should put in there as well. And except while they had Udo. There are a lot of bands that I like that are not metal bands. As a matter of fact, this weekend we are going to be seeing a band that may surprise many of you that I have liked since my preteen years, and that's Duran Duran. And we're like super looking forward to that because we saw on TV a concert with them recently, and they still have it, And we've seen some other bands recently that were pretty awesome, Styx put on an amazing show. Hall and Oates, that was a fun show as well. Um, I'm also a big fan of New Model Army. Never got to see them. Hopefully, will someday. I mean, who else do I really like? PJ Harvey, um, John Cougar Mellencamp, but of course he's long since gone insane. And so you can't really like see the guy who did the classic stuff anymore, I would say. So there's a lot of a lot of bands that I really do like. I don't really have a favorite any more than I have a favorite philosopher. I do have a lot of other people. All right. Let's see. Oop, it just skipped a bit again. Um, J. Crest, do you have any advice for reading something very dense like Marx's Capital? These long-winded texts are very tough to get through. Yeah, I mean, dry stuff there, right? And I mean, take Heidegger's Being in Time, or even Sartre's Being and Nothingness is kind of a head cracker, isn't it? You just got to keep plowing through it. Maybe you set yourself like a reading schedule. Um, I mean, the time when I was like early on plowing through these texts, I had the luxury of being in graduate school, and a lot of the times not even having a teaching thing, having a fellowship instead. So I had lots and lots of time on my hands. Most people, I think, don't really have that luxury. So I don't know that I have an awful lot of helpful advice other than just keep plowing away, and maybe find some other people that are interested in it, that are not super like argumentative or jockeying for a position, but like you can have good conversations with, because that makes it fun and interesting. you know MGL has a football question: is Aaron Rodgers going to retire after this season? I don't know. I mean, I thought I kind of knew who the guy was, and then he came out with all of his COVID craziness, and you realize that all we really see are the facades of the outside that are fairly carefully managed. And I don't know what's going on in his brain. I mean, he's going to have to retire sooner or later, and the Packers are sooner or later going to have to find a successor. We've been super spoiled for a couple decades now, having a good but inconsistent quarterback in Brett Favre from '90s onward, and then having Aaron Rodgers, who was sort of like Brett Favre except without the hokey dumbness and interceptions, constantly throwing interceptions, and he was kind of held back. He could have been he was a great he is a great team leader. He could have been a much greater team leader if we had gotten rid of McCarthy, who's now down in Dallas, years and years ago, and let Rodgers have a more participatory role in the coaching. But what are you going to do, right? The past is the past. Um, Last Naj, as a rare philosophy graduate that hails from Saudi Arabia. Yeah, that's very cool. How would you start a philosophy department from scratch in a country that has no philosophy departments? Now, that is a very interesting question. So, I mean, the first thing I would say is look for some native talent, you know. So if it's pretty rare that people are, philosophy graduates in, say, Saudi Arabia, we'll use that as an example. Figure out who the ones are and see if you can get them interested in, being a faculty member or being somebody who would be a supporter or something like that. And the reason I say that is you need to have you need to have a face for your students that isn't just a whole bunch of hired guns coming in from outside, but some people who can be good role models for them. And the other problem is the people that you get coming in from the outside might not stick around. So you need some people who have a stake in being there. And then you'd start looking around for who you can get to come. And if I was doing stuff in the present day, if I was like creating a philosophy department, I would want to bring in some people who would live and work in that place, but I would also design the program so that it was partially online and, could bring in people from the outside who, might teach a class or might, be faculty members, but not living right there in Saudi Arabia, and who would be, Zooming, Skyping, Google Meets, whatever, Microsoft Teams, whatever platform you're using would be participating in that way. And then I would also like be, I mean, if I could design something from the ground up like that, this is a fascinating question. I would be thinking about like, okay, who's going to be the regional accreditor so that the degree counts for something? How am I going to meet those standards? And how are we going to form connections with other, not just individuals, but organizations and departments all around the world to support what we're doing? In Saudi Arabia, I'm sure you'd also have some other issues. How do you make sure that you don't get in trouble with the religious establishment and the political establishment? That might be something important as well. So, but that is a really, I mean, that's a great question. That's something I'll probably be thinking about the rest of the day, and I'm willing to bet that my wife and I at dinner, when we're doing that later on, may be talking about that because she is somebody who helps like build programs, for example, the Culinary Institute of America. Um, so yeah, that's a great question. The King, any thoughts on the Situationist International or Guy Debord? Not really. I tend to think that the Society of the Spectacle is an interesting text, but maybe quite a bit dated and overrated. Um, let's see. There's a good question here for we're just skipped. Mikhail says, "Happy birthday! I want to ask what got you interested in philosophy." So I would say that I was always interested in some of the things that philosophy tends to focus on, like, thinking about arguments. My mom, when I was a kid, said, "You should be a lawyer because you love to argue with people." And I mean, that could be a good reason to be a lawyer, but it could be a good reason to be a historian or a philosopher or a rhetorician as well, right? So that was part of it. And I was always, interested in like bigger picture questions like, what's real, what's not, metaphysical questions like that. What are people, is there a human nature? What makes people good or bad? And then, I didn't really get introduced to philosophy in elementary or middle school. I did take two classes, one of which was Introduction to Philosophy, and it was terrible, just awful, dry, boring, dull, formulaic. And fortunately, I took another class that was supposed to be a sacraments class, a religious class, right? And the guy who was brought in as the substitute teacher taught us about Augustine, and before that, he taught us about Plato and Aristotle. and we did a lot of philosophical discussion, and so that was kind of helpful for me. That probably played an important role. Rhino, how many hours do you read a day? Depends on the day, and depends on what we count as reading. Like if you're asking reading actual books, some days I don't read any books. Some days I spend half the day reading. There's reading like for pleasure. There's reading for because I'm going to teach this thing tomorrow. There's reading for getting ready for a talk or working on an article. So there's all different kinds. And then there's, am I reading philosophy? Am I reading literature? Am I reading just, blog posts or things like that? Reading my students' work. These are all different kinds of reading. So I don't really have a measure like that. Casual says, I was listening to some Duran Duran yesterday. Reflex was the number one song when I was born. Funny when Alan Partridge called them the Thatcher Pop four piece. Yeah, I don't know about that. The Thatcher Pop four piece, I guess, because they were, not very politically involved and they were, kind of a fun band. Maybe that was the idea. Ben, what are your thoughts on Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky? Haven't read it, so I don't have any views on it. Ben Duvall, thoughts on Henry Armand Giroux and critical pedagogy? Haven't read them, so you're going to find there's a lot of people I haven't read. Keaton says, have you interacted much with Saint Therese de Lisieux? I'm in RCIA and think I will take her as my confirmation, or maybe John of the Cross. Nah, I never really read her much. So let's see. Here we go. Nishan Patil, any opinion on thought-provoking films? Yeah, I mean, there's lots of films that are good, but you find it in a lot of cases is there'll be like so much potential, and then it's not really realized because they have to fall back into the formulas of okay, we resolve the problem, the hero wins, or the love interest, or stuff like that. I kind of like the films where things aren't quite so neatly worked out, and I think there's a lot of them out there, and some of them could just be like telling a story that's quite interesting. My favorite film of all time is The Duelists, which is a early Ridley Scott film, and it's about these guys who are fighting with each other throughout the Napoleonic Wars. One's played by Keith Carradine, and the other one by Harvey Keitel. And Harvey Keitel is the belligerent jerk. And, so there's a lot of things about ethics that you could say that kind of fit in there, and the meaning of life and history and stuff like that. Banger says, Bon anniversaire, merci. Keaton Patrick, Jordan Love is going to set the league on fire. I mean, you hope so. Jordan Love is the second string quarterback for our Green Bay Packers. He's kind of uneven. I mean, you hope for the best, right? All right, Hans, if I remember correctly, in one of your live streams, you mentioned Marx was a very Aristotelian thinker. Could you explain what you meant by that? I don't think he's very Aristotelian. I think he's working within an Aristotelian framework. I mean, think about the way that Aristotle understands the role of political science in relation to the rest of society and the importance of, material factors like wealth and poverty for human development and the need for some sort of substantive political community in which we can live a good life. Those are all key Aristotelian ideas, and I see those as kind of central to Marx's work. I mean, you could think of Aristotle as somebody who's like, well, it kind of sucks that, not everybody can live the good life. We got to have slaves until we have, tools that can handle, like weaving on their own and stuff like that. And you could think about Marx in the 19th century as saying, okay, we've got those tools. How do we rearrange society so that human beings can develop their genuine human nature and not be just subjugated to a process that sucks the life out of them and throws them away? I mean, if Aristotle were around in the 19th century, I think he and Marx would have a lot in common with each other. Planet C64, I had to learn fast about Plato's Republic, and bam, you opened up my world. Thanks. Well, I'm glad that that's helpful. I mean, I don't have videos on the entirety of Plato's Republic, unfortunately, but there's a good bit of stuff that's covered. Book four, book one, book seven and six, and book 10. I probably need to do some more on some of the other ones. Oh, this is very cool. Rhino Horn, my old PhD classmate, is looking to start the first Chinese philosophy program in Bangladesh. You might say, well, why would you start a Chinese philosophy program in Bangladesh? Isn't that a Muslim country? Yeah, but Bangladesh is, right over. I mean, the only thing in between Bangladesh and China is, depending on which way you're going around, the Himalayas or the Southeast Asian countries. I think that's a great idea. As a matter of fact, I think that we probably should have a lot more teaching and study of Chinese philosophy here in America than we do. Unfortunately, I'm not equipped to be an expert on that. I don't read classical Chinese, but that is really quite cool. A lot of birthday wishes from Bruno, Atari, Diamond, Josiah, Adam. So that's good. Um, Ben Duvall, what are your thoughts on Lukács, Gramsci, Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain, specifically the character Leonaptha? Well, I got to stop you right there. I've never read The Magic Mountain, so I don't have any thoughts on that. Hamza, thoughts on Cobblestone's History of Philosophy? And I got him right over there. So I think Cobblestone is pretty good still today. And he's pretty reliable. I mean, there's some places where you're like, yeah, I don't know that he's got this completely right, but he rarely leads you astray. He's good at not jumping onto bandwagons or, reductive approaches to things. I was just bringing him up the other day in terms of Hegelian thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which everybody knows Hegel didn't use, right? And Cobblestone has like a whole, two paragraphs or three paragraphs on how all these other people get this screwed up and what's actually going on in Hegel's work. So I think he's pretty good. Um, let's see. Ben Duvall, Barack Obama was a student of Saul Alinsky. Yeah, so what? I mean, we're not all like, clones of the people who we study with. I mean, how many students of mine do you think are out there doing exactly what I do? So that's kind of irrelevant. Some more happy birthday wishes from Ashburn, Zach, Night Shift Stoic, Cola Moose, and K Ghost and Randall. Um, Andromeda, any ideas how to be intellectually engaged outside of a college environment? Lots of ideas. I mean, that's part of what I do, right? You can do it by participating in communities like this on YouTube, or you can find local groups that are interested in doing philosophy, whether it's a Death Cafe or Socrates Cafe or Stoic Fellowship or Sophia chapter, all those sorts of things. And there's all sorts of international communities that you can participate in. And it's good to remember too that a lot of the people that we study in academic philosophy, they had lives outside of the academy. Descartes had a few offers to teach in Amsterdam, but he did his own thing, right? I mean, he was a tutor to Queen Christina of Sweden, but that didn't last long. He got sick and died. um, but he's a prime example. um, Even those who opened up schools like Epictetus were very involved in their community. So there's lots and lots of ways. Powell, any thoughts on phenomenology? That's a vast field. Yeah, I mean, I like quite a few phenomenologists. I actually wrote my master's thesis on Husserl. I routinely teach Heidegger and Gabriel Marcel, and um, I mean, Sartre is kind of a phenomenologist. He's using some of the resources, so I guess you could count him in there. Sometimes teach Max Scheler as well. So, um, oops, just skipped again. Let's see what we got going on. Randall says, "Are you tired of talking about Philip K. Dick because I want as much information on his work as you can give?" No, I'm not. I'm not not tired of Philip K. Dick. As a matter of fact, I'm, as you know, his fans are called, a big dickhead, and I'm probably going to do more videos on his various novels and some of his other pieces. I'm actually having to move. I was going to do him for Worlds of Speculative Fiction, but I'm moving the one from this month, which is J.G. Ballard, to next month, and displacing Dick to next year. But one of the things I'd love to do, one of the projects I've wanted to do for a long time, is to like go through all of Dick's work and produce something like a glossary of all of the philosophical, theological, and psychological terminology and concepts that he's using, and produce that as like a book. I think that would be a really fun research project. So Otari, would you recommend any texts about the social background for religion, a more anthropological view of religion, to be clear? Nothing comes to mind offhand. Donald Schulten is an avid fan of speculative fiction. Which invented world have you found to be the most interesting as a vehicle for discussing philosophical concepts? I mean, R. Scott Bakker comes to mind. R. Scott Bakker was a philosophy graduate student who really only didn't finish his PhD because he started bringing out the first parts of the Second Apocalypse 7-book series that has a lot of philosophical content worked into it, metaphysical, ethical, epistemological. Um, it took me a long time to warm up to it, but Neil Stephenson's Anathem, example. I mean, Philip K. Dick obviously has a lot of philosophical content built into his works. Uh, Characters discuss it. Dostoevsky is another example. Somebody, Ursula K. Le Guin. Um, Even Roger Zelazny, I would say, there's quite a bit of interesting philosophy in there as well. Um, all right. Juancho, how do you read Plato's Seventh Letter, specifically on the refusal of putting thought in text form? I think that, so if you're not familiar with it, Plato's Seventh Letter distinguishes between a number of different ways in which we can communicate and whether we can actually communicate the reality that's out there. For example, the forms. And so I think it's paradoxical. I think it can be an effective piece to read and think about, but of course it's paradoxical because the letter itself is communication about the inability to communicate. Um, Zeitgeist, do you plan on doing any other giant projects when you finish the half hour Hegel series? Yeah, I do. The next text that I want to apply the half hour Hegel methodology, or this close reading methodology, which by the way, I've already applied to another text, Epictetus' Enchiridion, right? Is Descartes' Meditations. And I have a really great copy that may be on the bookshelf right behind me of Descartes' Meditations that I was fortunate enough to find in a used bookstore. I want to say actually in Portugal. Um, when I was there in 2001. So it's the Presse Universitaire de France version that has the French, which is not the original, by the way. It has the Latin original that Descartes wrote in, and then the French translation of that. And so it's also got the objections and replies, which I may or may not do. Um, but I thought I would apply the same sort of thing to the meditations. Obviously, it won't take as much time as the phenomenology. And then I was thinking, maybe starts being a nothingness. Um, I don't know. I have to consider what I'd be up for after that. I mean, I also have to find new crowdfunding for it as well, because these things take a lot of time and work. Um, Ridicule says, random question. Do you look at Aristotle's mean state as a range or single point on the spectrum? Neither, because Aristotle's mean state is not just about a spectrum. There's all these, right way, right time, right person. It's a lot more complicated than just a spectrum. Keaton, opinion on the societal philosophical impacts of TikTok. I don't really have any because I don't pay much attention to it. Kagos, what's a good way to start with Heidegger? So I start my students with what is metaphysics. And the advantage of that for you, if you're starting with Heidegger, is that I already have a whole series of videos on that essay, What is Metaphysics, and podcast episodes. So that might be a good place. I like it because it brings in a lot of the key themes that are going to show up in other Heidegger works, like anxiety, or the history of metaphysics, or the nothing, or all these cool things. Um, and it does so in one single article. So I think that's a good place to start. Drewer, thoughts, reflections, dreams on Carl Jung. I think Carl Jung is highly overrated. I find when I read him, when he's talking about other people, I find that much more interesting than his own system. I'm not big on Jungians as well. Keaton, since you're a fan of phenomenology, have you read any Edith Stein? I've read Edith Stein, yeah. She was actually at the very first Société Thomiste Day of Studies in Juvisy in France. She was the invited guest to talk about connections between Thomism and phenomenology. Toby House, do you think you may go back to hosting public speculative fiction talks, reviews? I don't know what you mean by go back. I've been doing that consistently, right? Um, we just last month we did Rogers Zelazny, so I've been doing that for a long time. Um, Ben, let's see. Ben says, if you're curious, oh, this is just addressing somebody else about Michael Sugré. I mean, I knew about Michael Sugré years and years ago. The early Frankfurt school just has not been that influential. Anybody who tells you that they are is full of crap. It'd be great if they actually were more influential, but they haven't been. They've just been used as kind of a whipping post for conservatives. Nishant, do you find Schopenhauer a depressing experience? We read a few essays in Boom World. Too bad. No, because I don't have to buy into whoever I'm reading. You know, I'm not that influenced by them, you know. And I enjoy reading Schopenhauer. He's a great writer. I mean, the one thing I don't like about Schopenhauer is his invidious complaints about Hegel, but you just overlook that. You're like, well, it's sort of like having a friend who's got a few things wrong with them, and every once in a while they want to talk crap about somebody, and you're like, listen, I'm not interested in that. So, all right. Guy, what is your opinion on the new Dune movie? Very promising. We'll see if the next installation keeps it up, right? That's kind of important. Oh, here we go. Bendeval. Professor James Lindsay's new discourses, blah, blah, blah. Lindsay is an idiot. And anybody who takes him seriously, going to say this as well, is pretty stupid too. So, I mean, this is a great come to Jesus moment for you, I suppose. Lindsay is so nutty and such a hack that he's not to be taken seriously. Paul Heinrich Dietrich, to what extent can philosophy be considered as independent of science in your view? All the way. I mean, every discipline is pretty independent of other disciplines. Science isn't a big capital S thing. There are the sciences, and they're all over the place, right? There's no such thing as science capital S anymore than there is, philosophy capital P. That's all the same thing. Um, let's see here. Keaton says, I would be excited for the half hour Descartes and Sartre. I would definitely contribute to the funds. That's good to know. Ann San, happy birthday. Are you familiar with Lambda? And I'm familiar with Lambda, but Lambda was some, I don't remember exactly, like, or maybe I'm mixing it up with something else. It had to do with like age of consent and stuff like that. So I don't know what that would be in terms of AI sentience. So that's kind of a non-starter. Mikhail, do you think Michael Sugré explains philosophy properly and clearly? Some of the time, and I wouldn't rely on him overly. Like everybody else, he's got his own peculiarities. His stuff is quite, the stuff that's out there on YouTube is quite old. Um, KSBF, do you think Sartre is correct in rejecting Freud's unconscious dualistic split of a psychic unity in the self, instead that what is repressed is known to be the conscious mind? I think they're both wrong, quite frankly, on this sort of thing. So, um, Miag says, happy birthday. What do you think about Seneca's letter to Lucilius, where he says you should not read too widely? Well, he's saying you shouldn't read too widely because you should read deeply. And I kind of think that, it's up to us what we want to do. There is a danger of being very superficial, especially if we're reading garbage, things that pretend to be great, takes on philosophy quite often aren't. Good example of this is Durant's The Story of Philosophy, which gets a lot of things wrong and gives people the impression that they actually know what they're talking about. So it's very funny here. There's like a big fan club for Michael Sugre. I mean, it's weird that you would show up here and then try to convince me that I should check out somebody who I checked out, over a decade ago. But I guess you should form a fan club or something. Ben Felt and Marx say happy birthday. CSL, happy birthday. Drewer, interesting that one of the few times you've resorted to name calling as regards Lindsay. I resort to name calling all the time. And I'm not going to take Lindsay seriously. I blocked him on Twitter with the stupid drivel that he was saying. And frankly, I'm not going to waste my time with that. If you want to follow Lindsay, then you go this way and I go this way. And I know that the path I'm taking is a good one, and you can find out where your path leads. Sophie Kefford, happy birthday. I loved your videos on Cicero. They were really helpful as I was writing my dissertation on him. That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. CSL, what is the difference between essentialism and nominalism? Depends on who you ask and whose isms you have in mind. KBSF, can you elaborate on why both Freud and Sartre are wrong on their premises of the unconscious? I think Freud's theory is there's interesting bits to it, but I think that he's wrong in the way that he construes things, and I think that Sartre is wrong in saying that no, it's all consciousness, and you've just like hidden some of it from you. There can be other ways to work on that. Ben, thoughts on ideologies being a new religion and psychoanalytic critical theory, the new superstition? I'd say that's a really dumb perspective to take, and I hope that you can work your way out of that so that you can live a good intellectual life. But if that's the sort of nonsense that you're buying into, I just feel pity. Mahan, happy birthday! Love your content from Iran. Nice to have people. It must be pretty late here, right? KBSF asked about particular birthday memory. I mentioned that earlier. I do have to get wrapping up pretty soon too, because I have some other things I have to do. Andrew Van Orden, happy birthday. I'm glad I finally caught a live stream. I've been meaning, Charles Taylor, right? I've loved his books, but I found out his book on Hegel isn't viewed positively. Yeah, Taylor's an interesting guy. I'm not a big fan of his. He makes claims that you seem a bit implausible, like interiority was discovered with Augustine. You're like, has the guy not read much Hellenistic philosophy? I don't know about that, but he's important. Mahan, is it fine for someone to start philosophy by reading the Republic? So that's a great question. You can start philosophy reading anything you want, right? There's no one single you have to come in this way or you have to come in this way place. And the Republic is not a bad place to start. It's a pretty long book, and with any text in philosophy, you're gonna have an initial read of it, and you're gonna get at best like maybe 1/3 of what's actually going on, maybe less than that. In my case, usually less than that. And you're gonna have to come back to it after reading other texts, and you're gonna have to reread. So, I don't think it's a bad place to start. If you're going to talk about Platonic dialogues, you could also start with the Apology, or with the shortest dialogue, the Ion, or you could start with the Symposium, or you could start in all different places, right? Rhino Horn, what's your opinion on Russell's History of Western Philosophy? Well written, poorly thought through. I wouldn't rely upon it. Ben, thoughts on Ralph Waldo Emerson and his essay Self Reliance? I don't have any thoughts on that. KBSF, happy birthday, digging the Schopenhauer series. Yeah, I've got a few more lined up to come out. Ben Felt, simple question, where's the best place to start when reading Nietzsche and Heidegger? So Heidegger, I mentioned earlier, I start people off on what is metaphysics. Nietzsche, I mean, where should you start with him? I don't know. It depends on what you're into, right? If you like more systematic works, Genealogy of Morals and The Birth of Tragedy are the places to go. If you're into like more aphoristic, all over the map kind of stuff, Beyond Good and Evil is pretty good. You could start with Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and that's actually the first Nietzsche book I read. But I don't know. I think some people really like that, and other people not quite so much, right? Dr. Beavis suggests Twilight of the Idols. I mean, there isn't like a best place to start with Nietzsche, I think. Um, I mean, in my classes, I typically am having my students, like in an existentialism class, they're reading parts of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I also, have a supplementary reading on Truth and Lies in an Extra Moral Sense, and then parts of the genealogy. But I like the more systematic stuff. So Mahan asked about Friedrich Kobelstein's History of Philosophy. Just talked about that a couple minutes ago. And yeah. So Zeitgeist says, I would say Thus Spoke Zarathustra is harder to understand if you're not familiar with Nietzsche's work. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in it where you're like, what is this guy trying to get at? He seems really upset about stuff. I'm not quite sure what's going on. So all right, well, this is a good place to wrap up. I need to get ready for the rest of the day. I got to work on my Marquette classes, and because I'm teaching for them in the fall, get a shower. We're going to the Cat Cafe a little bit later on, and then so you'll see pictures of that on social media, and then having some, dinner at the Calderon Club tonight, so that'll be fun. So thanks for everybody for joining me, and 52. Hopefully, I'll have a lot more birthdays coming up. A few of you who have birthdays today, as you mentioned earlier, happy birthday to you, or you got birthdays coming up. And I will see all of you later on.